right? So you didn't talk very much about fuel cycle capabilities and where, how countries are incredibly dependent on other countries, not just for uranium, but conversion facilities, fuel fabrication, enrichment, you name it. I mean, it's not just at that upper end of, uranium enrichment, but I think there are only like 3 conversion facilities worldwide. We have one, I'm forgetting who the other, Converdyne, the French? Russia, right, yeah. So there are like 3 conversion facilities. Fuel fabrication, when a country has, it's not like, it's not plug and play, right? Even the enrichment in the fuel rods and the way you put them in the reactor is a specific design that requires like a year at least, so, to put together. And so, any country that goes down this path thinking that nuclear energy is a way to be independent, either hasn't done their homework or they're kind of been sold a bill of goods. But the real question I have for you on localization is this an issue for the industry itself, or is the Middle East, or those Middle Eastern countries particularly have problems doing that? Or is it the vendors who refuse to allow localization? Because the other example, the contrasting example is China, right? Right now, the US has a nuclear cooperation agreement with China, and we're ticked off because not only have they localized our technology, which we allowed them to do, but now they're using some of that technology in their military programs. So I think like China has done a pretty good job of localization. Korea has, Japan. So can you just talk a little bit more about what you know about these countries in the Middle East and their issues?
Sure. First of all, the economics we highlighted, or I highlighted in the presentation on the cost of producing energy also extends to the fuel cycle. So we did a study a few years ago on enrichment and whether enrichment makes sense for countries in the Middle East. The number we came up with is for an enrichment program to make economic sense, you have to have at least 10 reactors. And even then, it's much more economically favorable if you purchase the fuel from the international market, because right now the fuel costs and enrichment services costs are low, and you can benefit of that, and there are no signal unless there is a wave of nuclear renewable. There is no signal that these prices of fuel and enrichment will be higher. But no country in the Middle East have, even in their best scenarios, 10 reactors. So economically, there is no economics for any country in the region to build enrichment facilities or fuel conversion facilities. One thing is to talk about direct costs of building these facilities, but also there are indirect costs that are often hidden, such as cost of training people, cost of building institutions, supporting institutions. So if you take the overall cost, then it's really high. Now, localization, I think countries in the Middle East were never serious about localization. I think from the beginning they realized that this is unachievable, but the reason they mentioned it is simply to get political support to say this is not only a power generation unit, this is something that will bring jobs as well, and highly skilled jobs. So part of it was to really political support for these plans, but I think realistically speaking, they are aware of the problems. And again, and the nuclear industry itself is resistant, answering your question, to localization, because localization means higher costs. And also, in nuclear power, I don't know the exact percentage, but a percent or a portion of your technology has to be super high quality. For example, in steel, you have something called the nuclear power grade steel. So it has to be done in a certain way, using certain state-of-the-art technologies in certain factories.
Very few impurities countries because
Right,
of high
absolutely,
temperatures
absolutely.
and corrosion.
Absolutely, and the nuclear industry, of course, if you think about it, if Fukushima did not kill the nuclear industry, the next accident will. So the nuclear industry itself has every interest of ensuring maximum safety. So for that reason, I don't think it's realistic to talk about localization of nuclear reactor parts. Now you can think about localization of other parts, for example, other supporting auxiliary facilities, but that, I think, the economic value of it will be very limited. The case of the UAE shows that this is a country that knows what it wants, and it wants power. So, but as a result of that, I mean, they realized from the beginning that they have little chances of implementing localization. So this has been reflected in the contracts and the speed and the economic competitiveness of the contract they got with the South Korean.
Does climate change play a role in any of the official reasons for wanting nuclear power?
No, I mean, not for nuclear, but also not for other things. And don't forget that the Middle East includes top oil producers in the world. And for example, Saudi Arabia has been resistant to the Paris Agreement. Saudi Arabia was one of the resistant countries to the agreement. So, you know, I think it's not in their interest to bring up the discussion on climate change. Because if, you know, the arguments for nuclear, what about the oil they are producing? And this was one of the issues with the Aramco, the Saudi Aramco IPO, because if Saudi Aramco becomes an openly traded company, they have to disclose a lot of information. And one of the information they will have to disclose is their CO2 emissions at some point, especially for investors who ask about these things. And this was an issue for them. So the discussion on climate change, unfortunately, does not feature in the debate on nuclear. You might hear an official here and there putting it as a lip service, but I don't think this is something they are serious about.
Interesting. Now, in their domestic discussions or internationally, it just doesn't figure.
Again, I think domestically, no, as far as I know, but internationally they might say it, but I don't think they are genuine about it. But for me, I never heard climate change being the central argument for having a nuclear in the Middle East.
So one of the lines of arguments that we're hearing now from the U.S. So the U.S. the State Department rolled out a strategic strategy. I can't remember what did they call it. A strategic approach towards nuclear cooperation. And basically, if you take our nuclear cooperation policy and place it within the context of great power competition, i.e., we don't like Russia or China. They're the bad guys, they're the ones who are selling everything to everyone, right? And in this rollout, it just happened in the last few weeks, Chris Ford from the State Department talked about predatory financing by Russia and China. Now, that has to really just apply to Russia because China really isn't selling so far.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they're financing Hinkley Point in the UK, and they're going to sell, or they've sold to Pakistan, but they're not a big exporter right now. What would be your understanding of predatory financing? I mean, for them to come up to Jordan and say, hey, we're going to finance 50% of this power plant, and it's still not enough, I'm not, what would be your understanding of that?
First of all, I think this competition between nuclear suppliers is very dangerous because, again, it's if you compete against each other in the car industry is one thing, but if you compete in the nuclear industry is a different thing, especially if this competition leads to lower standards. But so far, I have to be honest, is that there's no sign of countries accepting lowering their standards of nuclear cooperation. I mean, for me, from a non-proliferation perspective, the Russian agreements in the region are the most are very suitable because they provide the fuel and they take the fuel back. Now what happens to the fuel in that?
Maybe.
At least on paper, I'm saying on paper. I think what I would like to see as an observer, as an academic, is more unity from the nuclear suppliers group, and identifying what are the red lines and what are the lines that should not be crossed because of competition between those suppliers.
So I had two other kind of areas I wanted to ask you about, but then I want to encourage everyone to get your questions ready. One is SMRs, small modular reactors. So it's kind of interesting to see the Middle Eastern countries interested in SMRs. Everybody's interested in SMRs. I can tell you whatever that means, but I can tell you when I was in North Korea 8 years ago, they asked me about SMRs. And I said, oh, these are reactors on paper. But you know, this is the kind of buzz in the nuclear industry. This is what's going to save the industry.
Right.
They're smaller. They're, you know, SMR is, I guess, in one definition, is a small modular reactor, and they can be modular either because of the way they are constructed, which means you reduce the time for construction and the cost because you don't have when it's a shorter construction time, the capital costs come down. But they can also be modular because they're smaller, right? So you can, I've heard of designs where you have 6 packs of, you know, 6 small reactors. Economically speaking, it doesn't sort of make common sense, or it's not, you know, to think that 6 smaller things would be more efficient than 1 larger reactor. But what is can you talk a little bit about the Saudi, they're already building, I think, a Korean small reactor. When they talk about small modular reactors, what are they talking about? Which ones, which technologies, you know, how, are these gonna be cheaper?
Sure. I think, as you pointed out, economically for small modular reactors, clearly large reactors are large for a reason, and which is economies of scale. So when you go smaller, your capital cost per the energy produced becomes higher. So you lose this economies of scale. Now, the nuclear industry is defending this by saying, well, this will be offset by producing so many of these reactors. So the economies of serial production will overcome or override the economies of scale that you lose. So the question is, how many reactors do you have to build to offset that cost component? But for me, honestly, economically, this is an irrelevant question, because the maximum cost reduction will be equal to the cost of large reactors. But we already see that the cost of large reactors is not economically competitive vis-a-vis nuclear, vis-a-vis renewables, vis-a-vis natural gas, and very soon vis-a-vis renewables plus storage. So the whole economics of small modular reactors, in my opinion, in the context of the Middle East, does not make sense. Now, for the Saudis and the others, I think what small modular reactors are just a cheap ticket to the nuclear club, because you pay $200–300 million, you build a small reactor, and suddenly you are a country that has a nuclear power plant. So as opposed to investing in building 16 reactors that would cost $100 billion.
Can you talk a little bit about what the energy mix is for some of these countries? So what are their other options?
So that's an interesting question. Historically, energy was, most of energy in those countries was generated by fossil fuel, mainly oil. And in the last 10 years, especially in Iran and Saudi Arabia, we have seen that natural gas has taken the driver's seat. And now, for example, all the new thermal power plants that Saudi built are actually gas power plants. Now, there's also a sense of commitments towards renewable, because in the same energy mix proposed by Saudi Arabia that includes the 16 reactor, The same policy also includes generating 30 or 40 gigawatt of renewable energy, which is also very ambitious, but in my opinion, more achievable. And when you look at in the region, the solar power plants are actually the cheapest in the world. Like the last bid for solar power project in Saudi Arabia was 2.15 cents per kilowatt hour. And for those who are aware with costs of energy, this is ridiculously cheap price. But this is, again, you have to take this with a grain of salt, because clearly Saudi Arabia, the investment costs are very low. So there's no, and there are some indirect subsidies that might have contributed to the cost. But even if you double it, let's not talk about 2 cents, but take 4 cents. Even 4 cents, you are still less than 50%, so more than 50% cheaper than nuclear anyway. So I think what's really exciting, if you ask me what am I really excited about, is storage. I think in the next few years, if cost reduction and storage become as aggressive as they are expected to be, I think this is going to be a game changer for the world for sure, but for the region as well, because then the whole energy ecosystem will change. And when you think about issues such as grid interconnectivity, smart grids, then this is really becoming exciting to talk about. So you have two narratives here, Sharon. One narrative is this futuristic, renewable energy-based, storage-based, that is, by the way, more inclusive to youth and gender. And you have another narrative that is historic, old, dirty, because nuclear power generates waste, that has problems with perception within youth and gender. So again, I think it's this comparison, I think you cannot put a dollar value on, but in my opinion, are very important.
Okay, I think we're happy to open the floor to questions. We do have a microphone. So Sam, actually, if you start right here, and then we'll go to Carl Stoiber after that.
I just have two questions.
Please introduce yourself.
Oh, my
and your
name is
affiliation.
Rick Davis. I'm an alum of the program. Two questions I have is, like you were talking about with the UAE when they were investing in the nuclear, and said it wasn't the cost. What was it? Why were they doing it if it wasn't cost effective? And two, when at the beginning of it, when I came in, you were talking about when the change in the approach of the companies with energy security and independence and going back to the vendors. And how are you saying that these companies are saying, well, we're going to make a lot of money doing this, or how are they doing it so they're not coming off as these, greedy business people?
Thank you. In the case of, can I answer now? Or?
Yeah, sure.
In the case of the UAE, when they started, the nuclear was cheaper than renewables at that particular time. But we knew that it's a matter of time until renewables will be cheaper. So what also played part of it is that oil prices were high at that time as well. So it would be unfair to say that the Emiratis did not think of cost. I think they thought of cost, but they thought of cost as one data point in the graph, as opposed to the whole graph. But I think also the Emirati nuclear program has an element of prestige that cannot be understated. Again, this is a country at the time that it wanted to show itself, and I think the international community wanted it to be the counter-Iran example. For example, if Iran has this problematic nuclear program, this is a country that can have also nuclear power but without the problems. So part of it is to provide an anti-Iran example. This is for the first question. For the second question, so if you could remind me.
I thought at the beginning you were saying that
the vendors and
within
right.
energy security, and it sounded like it was going towards the vendor, how the vendors would benefit.
Right.
You listen to this, are they saying, these companies are saying, well, we're going to make a lot of money doing it? It doesn't seem like that really goes over very well with the public to be for these businesses to be saying, well, we're doing this just so we can make a lot of money.
Right, I think, yes. So one of the reasons I'm basing this statement on is more recently, the nuclear industry everywhere, but mostly in the US, when they go to the Middle East and they meet with Middle Eastern officials, when I interview those officials, I bring up their discussions with the suppliers. One of them is NuScale, for example, a small modular reactor supplier that often engages with countries in the Middle East. And so the people I interview, they tell me that these companies tell them that one of the reasons that we know that nuclear is expensive. So these companies now, they are not naive. They know that the market is shifting and that economic competitiveness is no longer on their side. But they are not focusing on cost anymore. So their selling pitch to the countries in the Middle East is that although this is expensive, however, if you build the nuclear, you will be more energy secure. So this is what I meant by these vendors. Basically, is the energy security becomes a concern for them because they are using it as to promote their interests. I'm sorry if that wasn't clear.
Okay, thank you.
But interestingly enough, these companies don't make money off the reactor. What they make money off of is the fuel sales. Because reactors will operate for 40 to 60 years. Each fuel core is, I don't know, $200 million or something. I mean, it's the fuel supply over the long run. And so it's almost a very silly argument for them to say, you're gonna be more energy secure as long as you buy fuel from me for the next 40 years. So we have a question over here, Carl Stoiber, and then we'll go to Lindsay.
First of all, thank you for an outstanding presentation. I really enjoyed every aspect of it, really very well done. My two questions are basically derived from two words. One is waste, and the other is terrorism. Now, you talked about the Houthi attack. To what extent are these governments that are considering nuclear power evaluating the long-term waste issues, and to what extent is terrorism going to be a very significant aspect of their decision-making as well?
Thank you. So there is, not surprisingly, there is very little discussion about the back end of the fuel cycle. And again, for the countries that are connected with Russian plans or projects, they have solved this problem by saying that Russia will take back the fuel. But again, you still have the fuel, when you take it out of the reactor, it's called hot fuel. It has to be cooled down for a number of years. But again, this is not from only a security perspective, but also from a safety perspective, it's dangerous. And for example, in Fukushima, one of the multiple events that happened, it affected the spent fuel facility as well. So this discussion, this level of discussion about the safety and security of the back end does not really feature. I think the Emiratis and the Saudis are thinking of having a regional fuel waste repository, but this is not, again, there's not much details on it. And part of our work, and here we have my colleague Joy Nasser, who co-authored with us the nuclear energy monitor in the Middle East. Our next issue would be on the nuclear fuel cycle, and we will try to examine what are the plans these countries have specifically for the back end of the fuel cycle, because you are absolutely correct. There is very little information about, or very little clearance about what are the plans, if there are any.
So one selling point of these newer reactors, like some but not all of the small modular reactors and what we call Generation 4, is that they're built underground, right? So I presume that would be a smaller target for terrorists. But I mean, my assumption with Israel for many years was that they would not pursue civilian nuclear energy, not just because they couldn't find anybody to sell it to them, but because a reactor is an obvious terrorist target.
Yeah.
And so I would love to know what the UAE, what precautions they took or what studies they did, and what other countries in the region or how they're thinking about that, you can design a reactor so that it's, you know, not immune, but, so that if an airplane crashes
Right.
into it, you're not gonna have a core meltdown, or, you know, there are certain design things, but until you've eliminated terrorism in the region, you're still gonna have some kind of problem.
Yes, I think you're right. In the terminology of nuclear reactors and reactor operators, you have two types of big accidents. You have design basis accidents that are thought about, that people thought about, that if this sequence happened, then this might happen, right? Core meltdown, pressure, depressurization, all these events. But you also have a category that is called beyond design basis accident, which is essentially what you mentioned, those accidents that no one thought about. Fukushima is one of them. Who would have thought that putting the diesel generators in the basement, and you have this huge tsunami that would overcome this barrier and then flood the basement, then it will hold the diesel generators, and then the pump will stop, and then the cooling will stop. It's a sequence that is unthinkable, but it happened. And this is the problem with nuclear power. The problem is the unthinkable can happen sometime. And given the complexity of the system, no one can assure you, even if you talk to nuclear operators and nuclear designers, they talk about probabilities. It's a very low probability, like these advanced reactors. And I have to admit, from a physics perspective, they are superior safety-wise. One, they are smaller, therefore, it's certainly safer. You have less fissile material, that's obvious. But also, if you have a smaller core, then you can deploy passive cooling and all these things that are true, and But again, what are the conditions that these physical quantities have been measured or predicted? What about pressure? What about temperature? What about events that no one thought about? But I think going back to the Middle East, my fear is not much what can happen as a process, as accidents in these like reactors, unintentionally, but what can happen intentionally. People have spoken about insider threat. For example, if you look at Egypt, in the last few years, a number of terrorist attacks happened in Egypt because of insider threat. The Russian plane was downed because there was a collaborator in the airport and the police that let this to pass. Few months ago, the helicopter of the interior minister and the defense minister was targeted. How did this terrorist group know that this is two of the most important public servants in that helicopter? So certainly insider threat is a major issue. So I think here's the risk. I mean, going back to the United Arab Emirates, you have to give them a credit that they are really doing their best to think about potential accidents. And for example, recently there was a report that there was a crack in one of the buildings. And the fact that they have announced this crack, for me, is a positive news, because it shows transparency. It shows that they are serious about nuclear safety. But maybe in other countries, they will try to hide it. But again, like, I think it's not about the intentions of the UAE government, because I'm sure that the Emiratis have all the intentions to have a safe and secure nuclear program. My problem is not about their intentions, but possibly intentions of others and intentions, I mean, the complexity of the technology.
Thanks for your presentation. It was really interesting. I'm Lindsay Kroll. I'm a fellow here at GW, and I study nuclear waste. And I've been looking at small modular reactors, and yeah, they're probably going to generate like at least an order of magnitude more waste than large reactors. And even considering, they have a lot of economic deficiencies, SMRs do, that have come up in recent years. And so it seems like the argument has evolved towards we need to deploy these for niche applications. And with respect to the Middle East, there's a lot of talk about using SMRs to desalinate water. Do you think nuclear would be, preferable for that over solar? or can you just talk about like how these countries look at the niche applications?
Sure. Thank you for your question. I think this link between nuclear and desalination is a very important link because countries like Saudi Arabia, part of their rationale now is to use nuclear power for, as you mentioned, for desalination. And here you have two sides of the story. The first side is economic. When you talk about economics of desalination, it depends on the desalination technology. If you are using thermal desalination technology that uses heat, then coupling it with a nuclear is, as a heat source, is not a bad idea. And actually, it's more economic than coupling it with solar.
Even solar thermal, like concentrated solar thermal, not PV.
I mean, I think it's I would say yes, because the concentration of heat, the amount of heat that you get out of a nuclear reactor is much more. Now, and it's because it depends on the operating temperature. But I think the problem for me, before I move to the other technology, which fits perfectly with solar, which is the RO, because the RO is not a thermal process. RO can be electric process.
Reverse osmosis.
Sorry, yes, I apologize. Yes, so this process fits perfectly with solar. Why? Because then in periods when you have excess of power generation, you can use this excess of power to actually desalinate water much, much cheaper than the thermal. So this is my answer. You are right if you forget about the thermal. But let me go back to the thermal. Now, even if this is economically feasible, here's my more important worry about it. My more important worry about it is if there is an accident and there's a leakage to the water of the sea, because normally these reactors have to be placed near the coast. Here's a sober observation. 90%, I mean, some countries in the Gulf, their water is 90% comes from desalination, such as Qatar, for example. And the Gulf is a semi-closed sea. And one of the studies showed that if you follow a molecule in the Gulf, it takes 2 years from the entry to exit. So if there's any radiation leakage that goes to the sea, all the countries that depend on desalination will be affected. So think of millions of people who rely on desalinated water being prevented from using this water because it's contaminated. And think of the other political issues about trying to cover it, for example. And we know from Chernobyl and Fukushima that these governments, at the beginning of the accident, tried to cover up. But the risk here, if one government tried to cover, then it's too late, because millions of people have already drunk contaminated water. So for me, this is much more important than the economic aspect. But you are absolutely correct. I think when you talk about desalination, we should think about coupling not the thermal technologies, but the electrical technologies such as the reverse osmosis with solar power.
Can we have a few questions and then?
I'm Pierce Gordon, doing work in more on the security end, but also have a strong interest in the energy end because my background's in solid-state physics, so physicists like you. One of the points that you worked through at the beginning was the importance of oil, petroleum in the Middle East as a source of income for the Middle East countries. If and when the world, and it will eventually, since the sources will dry up, but let's suppose it happens sooner, do you have any feel for what the governments look at for a more sustainable economic base in their society if it becomes, if oil becomes a non-profitable export?
Thank you very much. That's a very important question because it poses an existential issue for these countries. When they rely heavily on oil revenues, and we all know that, as you rightly pointed out, that this may not be for a long time, then economic diversification becomes an issue. So here, that's actually my argument when I talk with governments about nuclear versus renewable. So nuclear and renewable, both of them, they give energy diversification. Because if you build the nuclear and if you build renewables, you are diversifying your energy. But with renewables, you get extra. You get economic diversification, which is more important than energy diversification. Because you have higher level of local content. For example, now Saudi Arabia has factories that build solar panels. For sure, they are not cheaper than China. No one can beat China with that. But still, this can be, they can invest, and they are investing in that. One of the leading companies in the region and perhaps in the world is a company called Aqua Power, which is a Saudi company. So they have already built a track record of building technology companies in the renewable energy field. And third, renewables localization is not a political headache as it is for nuclear, because if you localize a nuclear, you have the IAEA over your head, you have the US over your head, you have so many suspicions, and given the complexity, the political complexity of the Middle East, you will never feel free to pursue this plan. And fourth, the nuclear industry is a very slow industry. The nuclear industry is not creative industry. If you look on paper, small modular reactors is one good example. There are some amazing designs for small modular reactors that are designs, by the way, that can burn waste as well. I mean, but the problem that converting these ideas from looking super sexy and super attractive on paper to actual plans, it's a very slow process. You have regulations, you have tests, and one thing this leads to that we don't afford is time, because climate change is happening soon. Economic diversification needs to be done soon. So can we afford to wait 20 years until we are capable of building our reactor, while if we invest in other energy sources? So again, thank you for this question, and this goes back into the ultimate need for countries in the region to think of energy as a service, and not that can help economic diversification as opposed to just an energy source that can diversify with other energy sources.
Hi, thank you very much, Ali. I'm Philip Cornell from the Atlantic Council Global Energy Center. I had a quick question about power markets. Power markets in the Middle East are undergoing reform in a lot of the countries. I mean, buying from independent power producers, unbundling transmission and distribution. And talking about T&D, there's also a lot of grid integration and grid integration plans in the region. So for places like Jordan, which you point out very rightly, are relatively small to put in a big new power plant, grid integration might affect that if it can balance with neighbors. How do you see those kind of power market reforms in the region and changes into the grid affecting the penetration of nuclear in the Middle East going forward?
Again, a great question. So one of the weaknesses how governments in the region deal with energy is that they deal with energy as generation, like sources of energy, and they don't think the market side. And I think a lot of the efficiency and a lot of what I call the low-hanging fruit is in the market side. One of them is integration of markets and grid interconnections, because the grid interconnections can offer you to have much more share of renewables, because in the case of access of power, you can trade with your neighbors, for example. And also at the same time, if the sun is not shining in your city, you can import power from Syria or Iraq. So this is one aspect of it, the grid integration. So on grid integration, unfortunately, there is not much infrastructure projects happening. The main challenge is both political and financial. So grid integration requires governments to sit down. It's like similar to gas pipelines. It's like you have to sit down and you have to agree, and this by itself requires some political momentum that is not there. But also there's a question of financing, like who is going to finance these grid integration? And in that regard, I think international financing institutions such as the World Bank and EBRD can actually have a role in promoting these ideas, especially that these banks have interest in promoting renewables. So one entry point for them is not to start with the generation side, but with the transmission side. I think that would be super effective. And the second component to your question is energy reforms. And here as well, it's massive, massive point, because it's much easier to reduce demand than to increase the supply of power. So one of the problems we have excessive consumption of energy because of subsidies. And but again, to their credit, the Gulf countries have done a good job recently in terms of, not Saudi Arabia, by the way. So for mostly all the Gulf countries except Saudi Arabia has done remarkably well in removing subsidies. Let's not forget that these countries have a very particular social political contract. So let's be realistic. So for them to do these reforms is not easy, but they have done it nonetheless. And I think they have capitalized on low prices of oil to push for these reforms. And in my opinion, that's very smart. But it should continue. And I think once this trend continues, but also in other countries, Iran, for example. Iran is a country where energy is heavily subsidized. Egypt is another country. Then what will happen once you remove subsidies, you would realize is that all your percentages of growth of power are actually inflated. And your consumption of energy will correlate more with your GDP. So if you look at these countries, GDP is 1 to 2%. And logically, energy consumption should not increase more than the GDP. It's normally there's some correlation between them. I mean, locally, regionally, it can be the case, but on average, your energy consumption should correlate with your GDP. But what you see is that energy consumption is 6%, your GDP growth is 2%. So there's really a gap there to save billions of dollars.
But, sorry, just to follow on really quickly, but do those reforms, which are meant precisely to court private investment, is that a good thing for nuclear power? Does that support the argument for more nuclear investments?
For example, for the reform, grid integration also serves nuclear. For example, with a grid integration, countries like Jordan can have a large power reactor, and Emirates can export more of its excess of power from the nuclear reactors. Now, does it benefit nuclear? My answer depends if you are on the nature of the market. If this market is regulated and you are getting PPA prices, then your success depends on the cost recovery of your tariff. If your tariff or your PPA price that you are paying the operator of the reactor is close to the number, then your losses are minimum. But if your tariff is very low, nuclear has the highest range that you have to cover. And on the other hand, if you have an open market like Europe, for example, or some states here in the US, nuclear does not have a future because natural gas is cheaper, renewable will be cheaper. So yeah, I think, but again, it's too early to think about liberal markets in the Middle East.
Do you have time for one more question?
Sure, yes.
Okay.
Thank you. Abla Hariri, Science and Technology Policy Fellow at the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering and Medicine. Thank you for the presentation. Very insightful. I have a question. Last year, I think, or by the end of 2017, there was this Triton attack on the Saudi Aramco petrochemical power plant that was, I think, identified as the first to deliberately try to attack or put lives at risk because it attacked the safety systems at the power plant. How vulnerable do you think the nuclear power plants are to cyber attacks, and are there any serious measures that are being taken in the Middle East, in those countries where they are seriously focusing on the nuclear sector? Are they taking any serious measures to cyber secure their power plants?
No, cybersecurity is a major issue, and I think Sharon knows because in our community there is a strong emphasis right now on cybersecurity and nuclear because for exactly the reasons that you mentioned, the risk is just too high. And again, but with cyber, you can come up with a lot of solutions, but at the same time, that there are things that you don't know about. They call them unknowns. So I think the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, and the countries, they started to think about cybersecurity. But again, I think cyber is one of these things that are intrinsically weak. So regardless of how much you invest, I mean, of course, you can safeguard yourself against some cyber attacks, but the technology is moving very fast, and the decentralization of all these resources and displacement of resources really puts a pressure. But also, I think cybersecurity can be influential not only in the reactors, but also in the whole electricity system. And as I said, the Ukraine was one example where the whole grid of the country went down because it was hacked. But then again, if you think about lives not necessarily affected by a nuclear accident, but lives that are affected by loss of power for a prolonged period. Think of hospitals, think of infrastructure that depend on energy and electricity. So you can do a lot of damage by simply disrupting energy, let alone initiating an accident.
Well, thank you for a terrific
Thank you.
presentation and a great discussion, and I hope you'll come back.
Well, thank you so much. It was a pleasure to be here. And thank you for super interesting questions.
All right, thanks.